The U.S. and unfair trade. Hey everyone, it's Wolfgang. So there's been a lot of talk in the news about the trade between countries, tariffs, trade barriers, deficits. I'm going to explain in this video what's going on. It's pretty simple. I'll make it simple so you can understand. To start off with, what is a trade deficit? It's really easy to understand. Basically, an example. This is a very simple example. Let's say the U.S. sells $1,000 of Hershey chocolate bars to Poland. This is just a hypothetical example. The U.S. sells $1,000 of Hershey bars to Poland, and Poland sells $100,000 of Polish sausage to the U.S. So the U.S. gave $1,000 of products to Poland and received $1,000 from Poland. Poland sent $100,000 of sausage, and we gave Poland $100,000. So we took in 1,000, we spent 100,000. So if you think about that in terms of your own household, if you're only earning $1,000 but you're spending 100,000, you will go broke very quickly. It doesn't matter how much money you have. Even Jeff Bezos will go broke if he starts earning $1,000 but spends $100,000 at the same time. He will go broke, and the U.S. will go broke too. So that's called a trade deficit. So that's compared or contrasted with a balanced trade situation. So let's change it up a little bit. Let's say the U.S. sells $1,000 of Hershey chocolate bars to Poland, and in exchange, Poland sells $1,000 of sausage to the U.S. That is balanced trade. In that case, the U.S. spent $1,000 on Polish sausage, but we received $1,000 for Hershey bars. That's balanced trade. That's desirable. If you think about it in terms of your own household, if you're earning $1,000 in your paycheck and you're spending $1,000, you're breaking even. That's balanced trade. Okay, so that's what balanced trade is. As long as we're receiving as much as we're spending, we won't get into trouble. The problem is this: the vast majority of our trading partners, we have a deficit with them. That's, the deficit is when we're spending a lot more than we're taking in. As a country, we can't afford to do that. We will go broke. We have a huge deficit in the U.S., and that's part of the problem is we're spending more than we're receiving. So I want to go through a list of countries that we do trade with. Mexico. We are losing $172 million a year in trade with Mexico. We're selling products to Mexico. They're buying products from the U.S., but we're receiving $172 million less than we're spending. So Mexico is making out on us at our expense to the tune of $172 million a year. Mexico is making $172 million more than we are, and so we have a deficit with them. Canada, we have a loss of $64 billion. That means the U.S. is selling, Canada is buying, but Canada is buying a lot less from us than we buy from them. We're buying too much Canadian product to the tune of $64 billion. China, we are buying $295 billion more of Chinese products than they buy from us. That's a massive imbalance, $295 billion. When you throw in Vietnam, because Vietnam is the backdoor for China. China knows this is a big problem. This is a big number. So China started shipping products through Vietnam, allowing Vietnam to relabel them as made in Vietnam. Vietnam is a small country. There's no way they're making $124 billion worth of product. This is China. So the total for China is 295 plus 124 billion. That's about $420 billion is our true trade deficit with China. We are buying 420 billion more from China than they buy from us. It's almost as if you go into a trade and the person you're trading with tells you they're not going to buy anything from you, but they want you to buy from them. It's unfair, but it's also not practical over the long term. You will eventually go broke. If you're earning 1,000 but spending 100,000, you will go broke. The U.S. is in trouble because of this. Germany sells $85 billion more to the U.S. than they buy from us. Japan sells 72 billion more into the U.S. than they buy from us. So we're losing 72 billion in wealth every year to Japan. Vietnam, I covered. Ireland, we have a trade deficit with them of a negative $87 billion. So we're buying $87 billion more from Ireland than they buy from us. Taiwan, $74 billion trade deficit. All these countries, we are losing this much money to. Mexico, we're losing 172 million a year. Canada, 60, this should be billion. I'm sorry, it says million. Sorry, that's a typo. It's billion. 172 billion. U.S. loses 172 billion, not million. I'm sorry I didn't catch that. Canada, 64 billion we're losing. China, losing 295 billion. Germany, 85 billion. Japan, 72 billion. Vietnam, 124 billion we're losing. We're losing 87 billion to Ireland. We're losing 74 billion to Taiwan. So those are trade deficits with all those countries. That means the U.S. is buying a lot more from those countries than they buy from us because they have trade barriers set up. And I'll explain in a couple seconds here what the trade barriers are that they're using. To give you an example, how trading partners do this, okay? Some of the trade barrier tricks that they use. The European Union buys $8 billion worth of U.S. cars, but the U.S. buys 45 billion in EU cars. That's a 37 billion trade deficit in cars alone. So what cars are we talking about, okay? The trade barriers that the European Union has set up so that they can't, so they make it hard to buy U.S. cars in the EU zone. And people, I got into a discussion with someone about this who said, well, U.S. cars are too large and they're too expensive. And that's why the EU does not buy U.S. cars. It's baloney. Some of the most expensive cars on the planet are in the EU. U.S. cars are not expensive by comparison. BMW, Porsche, Bentley, which is owned by VW, Audi, Ferrari, Lamborghini, Mercedes, those are the most expensive cars on the planet. The biggest market for those cars is in the EU zone. The EU zone has 450 million people in population. The US has far less, 340 million, okay? That being said, the US is buying 45 billion of these cars, these cars are large, they're not small cars. And these cars, they don't shrink them down somehow to fit in Europe. It's the same car. They're the same size as they are in the U.S. So this discussion I had with this person, U.S. cars are too big and they're too expensive. It's just not true. These companies do not shrink their cars down to tiny little you're not going to find a subcompact Ferrari, Lamborghini, or Bentley, and so on in the EU. They're the same size. And they're much more expensive than our cars are. So the U.S. buys 45 billion of these cars from the EU zone. The EU turns around and says, well, you know, we may have a much bigger population, but we're not going to buy your cars. So how do they do it? Okay, so they impose a 10% tariff. This was before this year, because April 2nd of this year was when the U.S. finally put its foot down and said, we're going to have to try to get to a more balanced trade situation. We're going to have to use tariffs to get there. Before that, I'm talking about before April 2nd of this year, the European Union imposed a 10% tariff on all U.S. cars imported to the EU, 10% tariff. The U.S. only imposed a 2.5% tariff. This was last year in 2024, before April 2nd of this year. The U.S. had a 2.5% tariff on BMW, Porsche, Bentley, Audi, etc. But the EU zone imposed a tariff 400% of that, 10%. The EU imposed a 10% tariff on any U.S. cars coming into their country. So that makes U.S. cars more expensive. So that's undesirable if you're in the EU and you have a choice between a home country car or a 10% more expensive U.S. car because of the tariff. Which one are you going to choose? So they also impose a value-added tax on imports. It ranges from 17% to 27% of the cost of the vehicle. So 10% tariff and then another 17 to 27% value-added tax tacked on to a U.S. imported car. Then they use excise duties. They have import quotas. They limit the number of products that can come in from the U.S. And they have very complicated customs procedures to discourage companies, U.S. companies, from trying to get their products into the EU market. So the EU is basically buy all our stuff, but we're not going to buy your stuff. Not very much of it. We're going to sell you $45 billion of our cars, but we're only going to buy $8 billion of yours. Right? So we will slowly go broke. The U.S. will go broke. We have deficits with these countries, as I pointed out. So that's how they do it. They use value-added tax, tariffs, excise duties, which are just taxes, more taxes, import quotas. They limit the number of products from the U.S. that can come in. Very complicated customs procedures to discourage U.S. companies from trying to import into the EU market. So that's called protectionism. And the reason I made this video is because there's been a lot of discussion that, oh, the U.S. has become protectionist. It's baloney. The EU zone has been far more protectionist than we have for a very long time. Look at the number. The US gives $45 billion to the EU zone for their cars. The EU is only buying $8 billion of US cars. And it's because of this protectionism they've been using. So there's a saying in life, everybody looks out for themselves, for their own best interests. And you can apply that to the EU zone. You can say, well, the EU zone is protectionist. They're looking out for their own manufacturers. BMW, Bentley, Ferrari, Mercedes, Lamborghini, Audi, and Porsche. Fine, that's fair. But we can do the same. And we have to do the same. And here's why. This country needs jobs for our citizens. We need our people to be able to work. It is inhumane to have government policies that kill jobs in this country. It is inhumane to our own people to have a lack of jobs, to have a lack of job opportunities. It is an inhumane way to treat our fellow citizens, to allow the EU to be very protectionist and we just open our doors and let them sell us. Because they've been ripping us off for, we've been losing $37 billion a year in cars alone to the EU because they're protectionist and the US until now has not been protectionist. So the reason I wanted to make this video is people have been resisting the idea that, oh, the U.S. is becoming protectionist. It shouldn't do that. Yes, it should. It is inhumane to kill jobs in this country by spending more in the EU than they are willing to buy from us. We must have jobs for our citizens. The social problems that result when people cannot feed themselves and their family are immense. The social fabric of this country is hurt by the inhumane way that jobs disappear. These trade deficits. So the desired outcome of this is to, instead of this huge imbalance, cars alone, the EU refuses to buy more than 8 billion, but they want to sell us 45 billion. To make that to make that fair, there would be a balance. There would be perhaps 20 billion and 20 billion. It would be even. And that way, the number of jobs for US auto workers would increase. If the EU decides, okay, we're going to remove our protectionist tariff, excise tax, import duties, value-added tax, we're going to clean up our customs processes so that we can buy more US cars, that would increase the number of jobs in the US. That is a valid, justified type of action that we would want our government to take to allow our own citizens to be able to feed themselves and their families. It's always important. I'm always going to get behind that. The idea that we should have enough jobs so that our citizens can work and feed themselves and their families. So whenever you hear that the U.S. is becoming protectionist, just remember all of these countries, they are selling a lot more to us and buying much less from us. They are making out like bandits. Mexico is selling 172 million more per year than they buy from us. China, 295 plus 124, it's right around $420 billion. China is making out on us. China is selling 420 billion more into our market than they will buy from us. So we will eventually go broke in this country. So the one thing I want to say about the protectionism regarding the EU zone, because the EU zone, the 27 countries in the European Union, have been known to be protectionist for a long time. Right now, they are being served up. They're getting some karma right now because China is now dumping products into the EU zone. Because the U.S. on April 2nd of this year, the U.S. said, China, you're selling 295 and 124 billion more to us, and you're refusing to buy our products. That's how much of an imbalance we have, 420 billion of trade imbalance. The U.S. told China on April 2nd, it ends now. It's going to end now. So what China did is they said, okay, 145% tariff the U.S. is imposing. We're going to have to start dumping our products into the EU. So the EU zone has tried to keep the U.S. out of their markets. They are now being fed cheap Chinese products that is destroying their companies. They're getting some comeuppance. They've tried to protect their own manufacturers. But when they allow a $10,000 Chinese electric vehicle into those markets, these car companies, they run to the government and say, protect us, right? So good luck with that, because their citizens will say, no, those are cheaper cars. We want the cheaper cars. It's a very difficult thing for the EU, but it's sort of a comeuppance, a karma, because they've been refusing to allow fair trade with the U.S. for a long time. So China is dumping its goods in the European Union because the U.S. put a stop to it on April 2nd. So The European Union is reluctant to tell China to stop because the European Union relies on China for clean energy and manufacturing inputs. Like apparently they get 90% of their battery magnets from China. So the EU does not want to impose trade barriers on China. Meanwhile, their companies are screaming, hey, we're going to go out of business. You know, we can't compete with a $10,000 electric vehicle. So the bottom line, the takeaway is this. The reason I wanted to discuss this unfair trade the EU has, it has a trade deficit with the vast majority of its trading partners. And this is killing our jobs. We're giving countries money and they're not buying enough stuff from us to create jobs in our country. We're trying to fix that. And it's a fair and justified thing to do so that our own citizens have jobs. So whenever you hear that the U.S. is becoming protectionist, just remember, most of our trading partners have been far more protectionist for much longer than the U.S. has. The U.S. has been the old jolly drunk, almost, just saying, you know, we'll let everybody in, we won't, we'll have no restrictions. And that has hurt our manufacturing base. So many of our jobs have gone offshore. So that's coming to a close. And if you hear that the U.S. is erecting trade barriers and becoming protectionist, please remember that all of our trading partners have been doing it for longer. And it's time for us to stand up for ourselves, stand up for our jobs in our country, stand up for our citizens to be able to eat and feed their family too. So if you have any questions about this, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. These numbers are massive. These trade deficits, these countries have been ripping us off. It's unfortunate that they've gotten away with it for this long. It's really hurt our job space, and we're trying to, you know, the government is now trying to fix it. So don't listen to the hype that the U.S. is doing something bad. It's not true. The U.S. is trying to put things in a balanced condition. The U.S. is not trying to get over on these other countries. We simply want a more balanced situation so that we don't have these deficits, so that we're selling as much as we're buying. That's the goal. So if you have any questions, please post in the comments. I really want to thank everyone for watching, and have a great day.